Kia ora everyone, noa ia, Māori ni sa pola vinaka, whakalopalahi atu, kia orana, malo elele, malo ni tono whalawa, tēnā koutou katoa, and warm Pacific greetings to you all. I'm Mimi and I'm from Engineering New Zealand and the Diversity Agenda. Thank you all for tuning in, and I welcome you to today's webinar with a special welcome to all of our Diversity Agenda members. If you work for an engineering or architecture related firm, please check our website to see if they are a member of the Diversity Agenda. And if not, we encourage you to get them to join. It's free and will give them the help and resources with diversity and inclusion. And so on to today's event featuring Sifa Pole, Ona Aime Columbus, Lama Tone, Karina Kalfusi, and Sina Korate. A key focus for us here at the Diversity Agenda is to improve Māori and Pacifica representation in engineering and architecture to help shape an Aotearoa that reflects us all. So this webinar addresses the question and starts a conversation about why are Pacifica overrepresented in the lower tier jobs of our construction industry, but underrepresented when it comes to our leadership, and what can we do to change that? Before our panel of experts enlighten us on all the levels of change we can each contribute to, I want to say a massive thank you to them all. Thank you, Sifa, Ona, Lama, Karina, and Sina for using your voice and including us all in this conversation. And lastly, thank you to you all attending for being engaged. This webinar will be recorded and we hope you share it with your peers and colleagues so that they too can be a part of the conversation, become more educated and aware and act. During the session, if you have any questions for our panelists, please do add this to the Q&A chat box. If you want to ask a certain panelist a question, it would be great if you could make reference to this, as we will do the Q&A at the end to cover these questions if time allows it. So, firstly, we will hear from Sifa Pole. Sifa migrated to New Zealand from Tonga when he was 7 years old and grew up in South Auckland. He's currently the Southern Network Operations Manager at Watercare, a role where he's responsible for all of South Auckland's water and wastewater linear assets. Outside of work, he is the president of South Pacific Professional Engineering Excellence, which is a collection of Māori and Pacifica engineers predominantly based in Auckland, but have members outside of Auckland and overseas. Kia ora, Sifa.
Malo lele, o lota whiwhia e me mō teitei lele au, kua malo lahi ki he Engineering New Zealand, he o mai whenga Māori e koe ni, ke tau tāno e ngahi mea maho inga koe ni whekau aki mo tau ngāo e koe ni I he malai engineer. So thank you very much, Mimi, for having me on board and the rest of us panelists. I know you mentioned that we are experts in our field, which I feel humbled by that, but I think it's just part of our culture at always undervaluing ourselves. So we need to try and get over that mindset of undervaluing ourselves and valuing ourselves a bit more. So thank you for having me on board.
Thank you, Sifa. So what is the difference between Western and Pacifica leadership values, and how can we encourage more Pacifica people to aim for leadership positions?
I think I'll simplify it by just stating that leadership is a reflection of the way people's worldviews are. And so you don't have to look far to see what the different leadership styles are like. It'll be based on what our worldviews are like. And so the Pacific leadership style is because we're very community based. And we have big communities. We're very family oriented and people oriented. Our leadership will be reflective of this. Our Pacific nations as well have a lot of history within the history of Christianity. So there's always this mindset of servanthood. Leadership as well. So there are times where we do tend to lead from the back, and whatever decisions we make, we are a lot more holistic about our decisions that we make as leaders. And similarly to how I describe the Pacifica leadership, Western leadership is also a reflection of the Western culture, which encourages a lot of independence, a lot of self-promotion, and Western leadership is also very performance different. And in the world that we live in today, you know, it shows that everyone wants performance. We want things done. There's a reason why we have KPIs. There's a reason why there are a lot of meetings about how to get things done quicker, cheaper as well. Overall, I think each leadership style serves its purposes. And I think just to add on to that, I think being an effective leader in today's world, you have to use a mixture, or myself, I use a mixture of both my Pacifica worldview and leadership style, and then also the Western culture, which I've learned in New Zealand, to try and see when is the best time to use each leadership style. And then the second part of the question was, how can we encourage more Pacifica people to aim for leadership positions? And firstly, I think if we have more Pacifica leaders in the industry, and the young engineers, or the rest of the Pacifica engineers in the industry see people like that, they can think to themselves, oh, I can aspire to be that. I can that's something that I can aim for. I can plan for. So when you see more Pacifica leaders in the industry, it makes it makes the rest of the engineers think that it's more achievable to get to that status, all those roles. And also, if we did provide maybe a bit more training and development, leadership training and leadership development courses for Pacifica engineers, and maybe making the trainings a bit more inclusive as well, just so that it makes them feel welcome, makes them more, or attracts them to the training and the development. So yeah, those are my answers to those to that question.
Do you think systemic racism prevents Pacifica from entering the profession and or striving for higher roles?
I think in today's world, racism is a serious topic, and one that does definitely need to be discussed. I think racism in any part of the world does prevent progression of any group of people, and particularly in our profession, it can discourage young engineers from joining the profession, and also engineers who are in the industry from progressing in their careers. At the moment, we have a very Balangi and male-dominant profession, and we have a strong history of this dominance, and I think due to the lack of representation in the profession, the industry hasn't had enough time to know how the Pacifica, how Pacifica engineers generally perform. And a lot of times, it is a bit risky for organizations to employ a group of people who they haven't really dealt with before, and that could be seen as a gamble. And due to this lack of awareness, and also the fact that when you think of a Pacifica person, you generally associate them with rugby, church, and lower socioeconomic communities. So I think it does. I personally haven't had seen too much of it in the industry. I think I've done a bit of contracting and consulting, and also working for a client organization. And I think the environments that are a bit more cutthroat, I think you'll definitely see a bit more of that that behavior. Whereas I can't say that I see it now. I mean, I work for an organization who is very diverse. I mean, we have a Fijian Indian CEO, and we have a very diverse organization. So I haven't seen too many at the moment, but I definitely can say that maybe at the start of my career as a site engineer in contracting, there's maybe a little bit more of that behavior. But I do agree that it can prevent or encourage the progression of Māori and of Pacifica engineers in the industry.
Thanks very much, Seita. And next we will hear from Honor. Honor is a structural engineer and infrastructure advisor with 10 plus years experience in Aotearoa and Australia. She's currently undertaking research into Indigenous self-determination and natural resources management and engineering decision-making processes as part of a Masters in Māori and Indigenous Leadership. She is proudly of Kiribati and Pakeha heritage. She's an engineer with shallow tear ducts who makes a mean corned beef sandwich and is committed to acknowledging and empowering community voices. Kia ora, Ona.
Kia ora, kamna Māori, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to talk today, Diversity Agenda and Mimi. It's a pleasure to be here to have this important discussion and also to be alongside some peers that I have a lot of respect for. So I've also been looking forward to joining today to hearing everyone's discussion. Thanks, Sefa, for kicking us off today and taking on that brave role of being the first speaker. And to everyone attending, I had a quick flick through the attendees list earlier and saw a lot of familiar names. So Māori to all of you as well.
Awesome. So why do you think it's important for people to acknowledge the diverse identities of Pacifica people, Micronesian, Melanesian, and Polynesian?
Yeah. So I think it's important for people to understand and acknowledge the components of identity as a starting point. In my experience, there's a dominant identity, like Sefa said, Palangi o Imatang Pākehā male, in the profession, and anything other than that is often grouped together as one and treated as the other. And so I don't just mean through our daily behaviors, I mean also systematically, like within our decision making and our practices within our organizations. And I think that's problematic when we're trying to progress towards inclusion and diversity. It's a big barrier to us achieving a diverse and inclusive profession. So when I speak with people about Pacifica identities, I find often we are grouped in this other group and people aren't aware of the great diversity that is in the Pacific and Pacific peoples. Pacifica as a term often infers Polynesian, which is one of those three groups, and the focus is often on ethnicity. So I'd really like to take the opportunity just to share a bit, some of my thoughts or important points about Pacific identity. Within Pacifica peoples, there is so much more to our beautifully diverse identities than just ethnoculture. We should also consider race, creed, sexuality, tribal identities and villages, and nationality. New Zealand-born identity can be very different to the identity of those born in the islands, just as it would be for European migrants versus New Zealand-born and raised Pākehā. It's also valuable to understand the international relationships between New Zealand and our Pacific nations. For example, the Cook Islands, Niue and Tokelau, they have free association with Aotearoa. So Niueans, Tokelauans and Kuki-Airani, they're legal New Zealand citizens by birth. And I guess, that's part of the identity of these nations. So my mum, she's from Kiribati. The nation of Kiribati is a country in Micronesia, which is one of those groups that's a little less well known than the Polynesia. Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia refer to geographic regions within the Pacific. And those three regions, they're home to people with distinct identities, worldviews, cultures, and languages. So for example, within the Pacific, there's about 1,500 distinct languages spoken, and Melanesia is one of the most linguistically diverse regions in the world. In Papua New Guinea alone, there's an estimated 800 distinct languages and over 7,000 distinct cultural groups. So in conclusion, why is it important to acknowledge these diverse identities? I think it's important because if we're trying to be truly inclusive and equitable, then alongside our dominant identity in the profession, this vast ocean of diverse Pacifica identities should be acknowledged, with each afforded the space to thrive in its own right. without being expected to conform or, trying to get those identities to fit within the dominant identity. And I think we can't move towards that if we're stuck in the camp of looking at things with the dominant lens, and assuming that all of the others are the same and that they should be engaged with and catered for, or given that space in the same way. I also think that learning about other identities helps us build empathy and self-awareness, and it improves our ability to engage with other ways of knowing and being, which sort of links in well with what Sefa was saying about understanding different leadership styles, the importance of cross-cultural leadership. So if we start to become more aware and understand these differences and diversities and acknowledge them, we improve our ability to do that. That can bring with it innovation, diversity of thought, and equity. And it creates a safe space for people of diverse identities to exist and for us to contribute our whole selves to the engineering and architecture professions.
So have changes taken place during your career regarding the profession's attitude towards increasing Pacifica representation and inclusion? And what are the levels of change that we can each contribute to?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I might break it up into two, like Sefa did too. Good leadership there, Sefa, following your style. But so have changes taken place? I've been working in the profession since 2009, and in the last few years, I have seen that people and companies have a growing desire to increase representation, and oftentimes the intention is there. And I think, I acknowledge and I celebrate that. The thing that I've seen a lack of is willingness when it comes to addressing the inclusion part of that equation. So I believe that to become inclusive requires us as a profession, as a company, as a team, and as individuals to change. And that's what I haven't seen so much of. So my concern with that is that we're really pushing for increased representation, and we're really encouraging our young people to enter the profession, and that's a great thing. And I was part of Specs and Sina, Karina, and actually most of the people in this panel were talking to last week to a young rangatahi about entering the engineering profession and sharing what a career in engineering was like. But I guess my concern is that as we push for that increased representation without ourselves adapting as a profession and as individuals, that they might enter a profession that's not safe and inclusive for them. So what are the levels of change in addressing your second part of the question? For me, I'm a pretty strong advocate that it starts with the individual. So I'd encourage people to be intentional with how they approach increasing Pacifica representation. It's really powerful to understand our own identity and our views of Pacifica peoples, like Sefa was sharing too, because that will help with unpacking things like racism and bias, which I think are big barriers in our professions. The issues like exclusion or marginalization, they're tough things to tackle. And they won't change by us wanting to do better. We need to equip ourselves and our peers to be able to do the hard and sometimes really uncomfortable work that is needed. It's important, I think, as well to distinguish intention from impact when we're looking at the work that we're doing in this space and to hold ourselves accountable. So one tool for individuals that I love and I'm a big advocate for, and I've gone back to uni to keep studying, is individual education and awareness. So whether that's cultural competency training, or it could be things like learning about Indigenous histories, learning about diverse peoples. Another thing that you can do as an individual is to diversify your feeds and the voices that we're listening to. So that can be through our social media, through our news feeds, but also things like academic readings. We have some really great Indigenous journals here in Aotearoa as well, and some great academics who talk about Māori leadership, Pacific leadership. And so that's another avenue, alongside reading about, engineering leadership case studies and examples. Also looking to find diverse case studies. Then if we move out to the team level of change, I think it's quite beneficial to ask ourselves, what's my role in the team to improve inclusion and increase Pacifica representation? Because I think we all have a role to play. And sometimes I find when you're talking to people, they think it's not their place, or it's not their space to say anything, or I guess to advocate and play a role in that. But I do believe that it is. We all have a part to play. So that could be that you're encouraging others to increase their awareness and their learning. Maybe it's to call out racism and be an ally to your colleagues. If you're in a leadership position, I would ask that that people commit to anti-racist education and learn how to handle courageous conversations, because in my experience that is a huge barrier, and I think it's pretty common, but it's invisible to those who aren't impacted by it. And there are some great programs out there. At the place that I'm working currently, there's a program called Beyond Diversity, which is it's originally from America, but that program actually gives you tools like a personal compass for having those discussions. It sets conditions and agreements for courageous conversations. For my Pacifica peers who are listening, I think that if it's safe for you, it's a powerful thing to be visible as a Pacific person in your team. To hold space in those maybe uncomfortable moments and spaces where everyone else looks and behaves differently. I'll admit I regularly code switch throughout a working day. But in those moments when I hold strong, my hope is that people will see it and that people will learn to change or want to change. Finding a strong network of like-minded people and identities in the profession has really helped me with this too. So I guess if you have those types of networks within your organization or institution, that can be quite a powerful thing. And then if we start to look wider or broader at levels of change, we could jump to a company or institution level. Some ideas: equip your staff with tools for change, like that Beyond Diversity program, where they give you, tools to have these conversations and talk through things. Value the skills of cross-cultural leadership in professional development programs. So include those in your programs and your frameworks. You could review recruitment practices. I've been to interviews where the job ads include competencies like inclusive leadership, basic confidence using te reo Māori, and understanding of te tiriti. And I think that's a great thing to see. But I have been in some interviews where it becomes quite clear that there's no one on the interviewing panel who feels comfortable talking about these things. And so I've used them and I can just tell it's making people feel uncomfortable. And so I guess that's something that I'd love to see as a bit more of a connection between the institutional change and that broader change that we're trying to effect through policies and practices. But to see a stronger connection between that and then individual level, so the people implementing it and how it's being implemented. I think that engineers are great problem solvers, and if we equip ourselves appropriately, we could be great at problem solving social issues as well, like representation and inclusion in our profession. So I'm just going to leave a few other levels of change that people could have a think about. individual projects. Maybe you're coming into a project, having your kickoff meeting. Why not think about how you could increase representation and inclusion for that project? If you're on the committees for professional societies and groups, looking at how you could do it in that space, and the engineering profession as a whole, which is exciting to think about how can we implement change and what are the levers that are available to us. Yeah.
Kia ora, thank you, Anna. And next we will hear from Lama. Lama has long-term aspirations to contribute to an architectural identity that celebrates people, regionalism, landscape, seascape, culture, and colour. He believes that a great sense of place and a regionalist design approach would enrich and enhance architectural thinking of time, space, and architecture here in New Zealand and throughout the Pacific. Lama was born in Otahuhu, South Auckland, to Samoan migrant parents. He worked as a carpenter whilst playing rugby both locally and abroad. He pursued his architectural studies at the University of Auckland after sustaining a career-ending neck injury in 2001 while playing rugby for Samoa. His inspiration to seek a career in architecture comes from his extensive travels around the world playing rugby. Lama is also a professional teaching fellow at the University of Auckland, which he is currently teaching design and guest lecturing part-time at the School of Architecture. In 2008, Lama formed New Pacific Architecture Limited, a company offering both designing consultation and construction services. Kia ora, Lama.
Ia, whakatau mo nea wanoa mimi au te momono whatalofa ma whawhirai o te whoile pa ia man malu le tātou whatasinga nei aso ia e me se lava le whawhonga ma le siasila mai o pa ia malu mo me masani ia wā lava se tātou talonganga po se tātou whaasoa i le ngai mata upu tāua le whaasolonga ma le tāpenanga o sā wāwhoi tae au mo le nei ngā luenga o le tusiata whale po le architecture ma loso fumanguia. Greetings, Mimi. Thanks for having me. Really pleasure in hearing the previous two speakers. So I'm really looking forward to some robust discussions around our hot topic for today. Thank you.
So diversity is not only the right thing to do from a social justice perspective, but particularly within architecture, diversity is vital to shape an Aotearoa that reflects the diverse range of people that call this land home. How does your Pacifica heritage play a part in your architectural designs?
Okay, so if I gave you guys maybe a bit of context, so it's Pacific common knowledge that Polynesians have a metaphysical relationship with their architecture. We know that Māori have a worldview that is a spiritual connection to land, sea, sky, people, architecture, and so do Pacific peoples throughout. We share a common DNA. Wherever we are in this world, this is how we view things. So a common jargon at the School of Architecture is the Pacific worldview versus a Western worldview. This necessarily is not a negative thing, but perhaps it just opens up the minds of students that there are, a couple of views here, if however you want to approach architecture. So how do we merge modernism and regionalism? So these are some of the simple questions and some of the, I guess, the questions that is behind the briefs that I teach at the School of Architecture at the University of Auckland. So a simple example is the Western view of the Pacific Ocean that separates the tiny island nations of the Pacific, whereas the Pacific view is that the Pacific Ocean binds these islands, as stated by Tongan theorist Epeli Hauofa. So my previous research looked at how Pacific peoples, and I've included Māori, are communal people, they're community people, whereas the Pākehā or the European is sort of more seen as individual. We've seen this throughout archetypical models, through architecture and their arrangement of spaces. So for me, my DNA is in my community, and my community is in my DNA. This is the VA, an intangible entity that holds all relationships. So to design for a community, we have to be a community. So this is my sort of approach to architecture. As Pacific peoples also, we also have a heightened sense of relationships. wherever we are in this world, we always find a way to come together. And we come from a sense of openness of space, whereas the antithesis of the European model sort of derives from compartmentalization of spaces. So a quote that I often use or refer to when writing or authorizing a design brief for my 30th students from architecture school is that I quote an architectural historian by the name of Kenneth Frampton say that the concept of a local or national culture is a paradoxical proposition, not only because of the present antithesis between rooted culture and universal civilization, but also because all cultures, both ancient and modern, seem to have depended for their intrinsic development on a certain cross-fertilization with other cultures. So in English, this just means cross-fertilization of ideas, both maybe in more region or more local ideas versus what's the international style or the international modern architecture. And I think this may describe modern Pacific architecture as culture that's always evolving and non-static and adapting to what it can to survive without undermining its integrity. Another quote from a famous French, world-renowned French architect who designed the Chiobao Cultural Center in Noumea in the New Caledonia is that he states that the Pacific is a culture of lightness and that he prefers it. Although he grew up in Europe, he felt more closer to the Pacific where lightness or the wind is much more durable than stone. So there's a whole, I mean, I guess for mine, I'm the only one in the architecture industry here. It's really encouraging and really great to see world-renowned architects who have sort of visited this side of the world, who are able to sort of give some comparisons, a very positive light. And, you know, hopefully that we can try and create or promote the Pacific to have these great ideas for designing great architecture, sort of rather than always looking towards Europe and North America for inspiration. Thanks.
Kia ora, thanks, Lama. So what do architecture firms need to do to make sure they are being inclusive towards Pacifica to help them stay and grow their career?
I think firms need to recognize, and I say this respectfully, is that geographically New Zealand is an island in the Pacific, and we are in the Pacific region. There are a lot of concepts in our own backyard, as I mentioned before, to designing really good, sustainable, contemporary architecture rather than always sort of looking towards, as I mentioned before, Europe or North America, you know, Asia, for inspiration for designing, you know, unique architecture that possibly can represent us on this side of the world, as we've seen every time you sort of turn, you know, the New Zealand Architecture magazine. So it's really encouraging to see that some of the firms here in New Zealand are adapting those notions or those themes for designing really good architecture. The premier sort of firms such as JazzMax and others are leading the way in using Pacific ideas to designing contemporary Pacific spaces and having a young, energetic and dedicated team made up of graduates of Pacific and Māori heritage that are grinding out the research on cultural concepts to use for designing these modern spaces. So that's really great to see. The other thing too, as mentioned eloquently by Sifa and Honor, is that another beast that that really rears its ugly head from time to time, and I believe it's a huge contributing factor to preventing Pacific peoples from progressing into higher tier jobs and leadership roles. And if I'm going to be honest, is institutional and systemic racism, and it's probably coupled with sexism. Now, this is real talk, and I shouldn't really feel apologetic about it. So today's topic on the diversity agenda is a platform and an opportunity to flag this, as I am one of many who have been exposed to racism, both directly and indirectly in this industry. And it's, believe you me, it's not a nice feeling. Now, I'm not here to provide answers, but to let you know that we have come this far as a nation. And this is where we are all now. And all I do know is that as my fellow countrymen and women, I have to work this out with all of you moving forward. So once again, I'd like to thank the, before I forget, the diversity agenda for actually opening up this discussion, because we really, really need to air it out. I mean, I've got a young son. We've got kids that will probably look into this industry at some stage, and it'll be nice if they seamlessly are developed into good New Zealand citizens with Pacific heritage, contributing to moving our country forward. So it's really encouraging to see many Pacific and Māori students starting to take an interest in Pacific architecture or in architecture. It is also encouraging to see many women pursuing architecture and also practicing architecture, as our industry is dominated by middle-class white men. This is real talk. I think recent studies states that more women studying architecture at the University of Auckland than their counterparts. So proudly, our wahine toa, or our head of school, is Professor Deirdre Brown of Pākehā and Māori descent. Well, we're going a lot faster than anticipated.
So, Lama, from an academic perspective, how do we increase the amount of Pacifica taking up and studying architecture?
Okay, so I think, my opinion is, I think it should be promoted quite heavily to all secondary schools throughout New Zealand, especially those in South Auckland or areas that are concentrated with Pacific Island and Māori. We also need to have more Pacific academics, and I know Sifa alluded to this earlier, and professionals practicing in the field of architecture that can promote architecture as a career choice from their experiences. I think also sometimes we need to get away from the stigma of our parents pushing our young Pacific people towards careers in law, doctors, engineers, and arts. And I know there's nothing wrong with that, absolutely, but I'm just biased. I guess if I can add architecture in there as also a very good degree to undertake, especially as the architecture scene in the Pacific are getting a whole lot more attention from global power countries investing infrastructure and architecture through these tiny islands in the Pacific and changing the built landscape. Some of these buildings may look out of place, like they have been cookie cut from somewhere half around the world and are rubber stamped around these tiny islands. But this is an opportunity for a sensitive approach to designing architecture in the Pacific. And with some gritty research and a respectful approach, I think we can knock that on the head somewhat. It's also great to see architecture students coming up with other approaches to designing great architecture in the Pacific through their semester's work. So this is, in a nutshell, this is what I try and push through every year at the School of Architecture, is that I take students, 30 students across to the Pacific. Last year we went to Niue, the year before that was Cook Islands, the year before that was Tonga, the year before that was Sam. So we're trying to steer some of the path towards the Pacific, as I know that they are probably at a more challenging time with the international aid having such a huge impact there. And I think that the students with some guidance can come up with some really great ideas and some great work, as I've seen over the years. So on that note, we couldn't travel this year back to Samoa, obviously because of the COVID. So I ended up designing the brief around here in Auckland, New Zealand. Just, it's not challenging, it's kind of just providing another approach to designing really meaningful architecture using our own ideas, whether it's from the Pacific, Māori, biculturalism, all that good stuff. So educating our young Pacific and non-Pacific peoples about the global impact in the Pacific, I think that's extremely important. It's just in our backyard. The Pacific is under huge influence of aid, including buildings pouring to the Pacific Islands from countries such as China, US, Germany, not to mention Australia, Papua New Guinea, and New Zealand. And these tiny islands, as I mentioned before, are at a really exciting but vulnerable transition in their architectural identity, if that makes sense. And as such, interpretation really becomes critical. So we begin to ask why and how are the Pacific Islands coping with the high influx of foreign architecture transplanted from overseas. If, is this architecture achieving, or is it speaking, or is it identifying and connecting with the Pacific people and their culture, landscape, seascapes, climate, and regional identities in the 21st century? That's the big question, and that's probably the what I get paid for to go to the university and teach this stuff, is just to provide them with some really good questions so that they can also see the other side of the world. Because some of my students, when we first went to Samoa, thought that Samoa still had these huts and women were still walking around in grass skirts. But until they got there, they actually realized how far developed Samoa was. And I think Samoa is probably at the melting point in the Pacific, where there's a lot of foreign aid coming in there, changing, the landscape. We know with Hawaii, I think Samoa is where Hawaii was 30, 40 years ago. So these are the discussions, or the robust discussions, that we probably need to have, and obviously push it out to our young people coming through, so that they can also think before they actually put pen to paper. So, as I mentioned, well, it's inevitable that globalization and capitalism do exist in our Pacific region, probably more so now than ever. So it's important that we have a say in how our architecture may look and feel, especially during this time as Indigenous language, arts and crafts and architecture are tested, during these tough times. So I think that probably answers the question in record time then.
Thank you. No, that's fantastic. Thank you, Lama.
Awesome.
Next up, we have Karina. Karina is a civil structural engineer working for Pika Limited, where she started as a graduate 5 years ago after graduating from the University of Auckland with a co-joint degree in a Bachelor of Commerce and a Bachelor of Engineering. She's Tongan and is passionate about uplifting Pacifica youth, particularly towards STEM careers. Kia ora, Karina.
Malailele, Mimi, o ko whakamalo ki he whainga malia o ko mau keu kau I hono tālanga I ai ngahi ka ve I ngani. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I'm very humbled to be in this panel with such amazing people, and also to have this opportunity to have this discussion with you all.
So what was your experience as a new engineer, and did you have Pacifica role models?
So I guess diversity is definitely a hot topic in today's society, and it's top of mind for many people and organisation. And given the raised awareness of this topic and of this panel discussion, I'm hoping that this is positive signs for step changes in our society and globally. I guess the question you raised, Mimi, is what has been my experience as a new engineer around diversity and whether I have any Pacifica role models. Firstly, I do need to acknowledge that racism and sexism exist in society, as Lama has already mentioned. To not acknowledge this would be ignorant of me. However, I've always had a mentality that anything you focus on can be self-fulfilling. And so I often focus on the solution rather than the problems itself. I've grown up in a school where it was predominantly white, and now I'm in an industry that is predominantly white and male, and I've probably had passive racism and sexism indirectly thrown my way. But I must admit, I've been very fortunate to not have directly experienced this. And so I am very grateful of this, because I do know as a new engineer that society has come, a long way from the Dawn Ray days, or the days when people, from the days where engineering students at Auckland Uni used to mock the haka as a graduation lark. And so people have paved the way for people like me to have a safer and a more inclusive space to work in. So I'm very grateful for that. As a new engineer, keeping my identity as a Tongan in a westernized environment is important. That means I've learned to continuously adapt and manage what's important in a corporate environment together with being Tongan. And yes, values of being corporately competitive versus being Tongan can sometimes conflict, as Sefa has talked about. but I've learned to adapt and ring fence what I need to do at work and remove this when I get home. And for me, it's about being aware of what these conflicts are, understanding how to navigate through them, and understanding the different dynamics and personalities at work, just as the same as managing my own family. And as an upcoming Tongan woman engineer today, it's awesome to see our country's leader value diversity within her team. Out of her 64 seats, there are 10 Pacifica Labour MPs, and that's history in the making. And I hope that this trend continues in the right direction in years to come. In terms of role models, for me, I don't have one Pacifica role model. I have many people I take lessons from. They are my parents, my family, my friends, my community, and people within this industry and from other industries too. I love to continuously learn, and I'm always curious about how I can adapt and make things better. So I'm always looking to learn from all peoples of all culture, different perspectives, different ways of thinking, and probably the biggest growth I've personally had are from people who give me the most criticism or are tough to deal with. And although they're never easy to deal with at the time, they've always created for me moments and breakthrough thinking for me. So I guess in summary, my experience in the construction industry has been pretty positive, and I would love to see more Pacifica, especially Pacifica women in my profession.
And what can our professions and its executives do to raise awareness and better educate Pacifica youth of the opportunities available in engineering and how to develop the emerging Pacifica already within the industry?
So as you had mentioned earlier, briefly talked about a group called Specs. So I'm a part of that group. And I'll probably reiterate, so our mission as a group is to grow a community of Māori and Pacifica engineers to promote the engineering profession in our communities, to support our ongoing career success, and to increase diversity in engineering. And an example of the initiatives we do to raise awareness and better educate Pacifica youth of the opportunities available in engineering is just last week, as Anna actually had mentioned, we had Anna and Sina present, we held an online engineering careers expo. And this was targeted at high school students looking for career options. And one important thing about this expo is the Māori and Pacifica representation. We are underrepresented in this profession, and so we're not very visible to society or to our communities. And this expo was an opportunity to showcase to our youth that there are Māori and Pacifica professionals within these spaces, allowing us to create that connection with them, as well as exposing them to opportunities available in engineering. So it's our job to communicate that there is an exciting career path in engineering, and that of those people can be the future influencers in our industry, the future manager, general manager, or chief executive, or Ministry of Building and Construction. And in addition to this, there are a lot of other great initiatives that target Pacifica youth in high schools. However, what I've realized is that we're probably coming in too late to inspire our youth into STEM careers, such as engineering. My dad teaches at a Desal 1 school in South Auckland, and with the majority being Māori Pacifica students. This year, there is only 2 students doing year 13 calculus and about 6 students doing year 13 physics at a school, and both are prerequisites into entering engineering school. Additionally, one of my Pacifica brothers who had entered engineering school with me went to a low Desal school in Whangarei, and he had to do correspondence, calculus and physics because the school wasn't providing these classes due to the lack of students entering these classes. So it appears that we need to be getting our Pacifica youth excited about STEM subjects a lot earlier than year 11, year 12, year 13. And I do believe that Engineering New Zealand, universities and Specs can play a role within this space. And I guess for the second part of your question, I think CEFA probably explained it quite well in the first question, so I probably won't go into that that part.
Awesome, thank you, Karina. And lastly, we will hear from Sina. Sina is a working mum of 3 and professional civil engineer with 20 years experience. Sina is a proud graduate of UC, where she has completed both a BE Civil and MBA. Her career weaves 3 strands: engineering, governance, and education, because a braided rope is stronger than its individual strands. She runs her own consultancy to serve clients whose values match her own, serves in a number of governance roles, and was a previous board member of Engineering New Zealand. And she's currently completing a PhD in construction management and procurement for public sector projects. Kia ora, Sina.
Kia ora, Mimi, kia ora, Diversity Agenda, whoever's on the call at the moment, talofa lava. Thank you so much for having me today.
So, engineering statistics show Māori and Pacifica make up around 6% of engineers, but when it comes to chartered engineers, that number is even lower, with only 0.5% of Māori and Pacifica chartered engineers. Why do you think this is so low, and what can we do to change this?
Yeah, the numbers are really low. You're absolutely right. I mean, that's less than 0.5% of us in the industry is chartered professional engineers. First of all, not all engineers go on to become chartered. We know that. For some engineering disciplines, it's not relevant to their work. They don't need it to practice, so they don't do it. I think for Pacifica engineers, it certainly indicates that there are not many of us to begin with. So of course, there's not many, even fewer of us who are chartered. I think there's obviously the pipeline issue, which we'll talk about in the next question, but there's possibly also a lack of engagement with the process itself, which I think is worth talking about. It's a problem, I think, because CPEng is for engineers, for professional engineers, it's a pretty important career milestone. It's sort of that first big career milestone that you go through. When I think about when I left university 20 odd years ago, and the cohort of about 130 of us all left at the same time, about 5 years later, that my peers from that cohort were sort of going through their first time being chartered. And now those same peers are going on to careers as, technical directors, principal engineers, managers, that kind of thing. And so I think the low numbers of CPEng who are Pacifica today sort of indicate that in the future there's going to be also a low number of us in those technical director, principal engineer, leadership roles. And I think that is something that's worth addressing. When I think about the CPEng process itself, I'm kind of a bit like my fellow panelists were mentioning before around the culture of our industry. The CPEng process itself can be culturally quite confronting. When you think about, for those of you who've done CPEng, you'll know what the process is like. And for those of you who haven't, I'll very quickly explain. You basically have to decide for yourself that you are competent, that you've met the bar. So you have to sort of have that level of confidence in your own abilities. You then have to put together a portfolio of your best projects, and you want to present yourself in the best light. And then you have to go and do an interview with a couple of interviewees who will also ask you to talk about your competence and demonstrate how good you are. There's a really nice whakatauki from the reo of my cousins, the Māori, which says the kumara does not sing of its own sweetness. And I think for people that sort of refers to very traditional Pacifica values around humbleness and humility, around not putting yourself forward, around, putting others in front of yourself. So if you are brought up in a very traditional value system, that values humility, that encourages you to wait to be chosen rather than choose yourself or put yourself forward, entering CPEng can be a really confronting and personally difficult process to go through. It's certainly not unique to Pacifica or Māori or even Indigenous people. I actually think that this is an issue that a lot of people struggle with. And so because Engineering New Zealand are reforming their CPEng process at the moment, I'd certainly like to see some consideration given to ways that process could be more inclusive for people who struggle with putting themselves forward and promoting themselves as an individual.
And what is your response to the argument that senior leadership is male Pākehā heavy primarily due to the pipeline theory? That is, there just isn't the diversity of employees with enough experience.
I think the numbers don't lie. We know that there's a very small pool of Pacifica engineers, so that's certainly a factor. I think it'd be naive to suggest otherwise. I think it is a problem. Our industry has come a long way, I have to admit, since I started in my very first job, when I first gained employment for a quite a large multinational, in fact, consultancy. And within the first month walked into the tea room to find an incredibly racist joke written on the whiteboard. I don't think that would happen today, and I think our industry has moved a long way since then. But fundamentally, engineering is about people. You know, we don't build bridges, we don't build pipelines just because. We do them to make the lives of people in communities easier, safer, healthier, better. And so not just what we do, but the way that we do it impacts people as well. And so we need to understand we need to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it and who's impacted by it. And we will do that better if we've got people from a diverse range of backgrounds involved. And certainly Pacifica people can bring a unique perspective to projects, whether it's, you know, an engineering lens or whether it's a community impact lens. So I do think we want to increase the number of Pacifica people in leadership, because even at a governance level, applying that lens and that different perspective can yield some very interesting lines of inquiry that perhaps wouldn't have been thought of if that voice wasn't in the room. I think also from a public facing point of view, it's almost not credible anymore to have organisations that don't have an element of demographic diversity in them. Gender diversity, we talk about a lot, but demographic diversity is increasingly becoming important to the general public. It's also becoming important to future employees. You know, Gen Z coming into the workforce now, they have very different expectations of their employers, and they are looking for things like inclusivity and diversity and those kinds of values. So again, it's another reason to have more Pacifica in leadership, and Māori as well. And I also think we are really just beginning to understand the value that Indigenous perspectives can bring to engineering and engineering projects. And I think it would be a tremendous lost opportunity not to try and capture more of those voices and more of those perspectives as we move into an infrastructure-led recovery. So I think the causes of the small pool of talent for leadership positions are also challenges for our industry. That's how I interpret them. The first challenge, as Karina and Lama have mentioned, is around the pipeline. And it's a fact that our education system is failing our young people, our young Pacifica people. It is a fact that they are getting filtered out before they even get to engineering school. Like Karina said, we don't have equitable access to education across all our schools. Similar to her story, my son is studying level 2 at the moment in a very large secondary school here in Christchurch, and he is the only Pacifica kid doing physics at level 2 or level 3. And there are issues there around under expectation, but there are also issues across schools around what's being offered and consistency of achievement standards offered across different schools. So I guess to bring it back to our industry, I think one of the things that we could do, our institutes could use their considerable influence to press for change in our education system, particularly at primary and secondary level. I would love to see pressure applied to our education system to ensure equitable science and numeracy education for all students. So that's one challenge. A second challenge, I think Sifa also talked about, well, in fact, everyone's talked about the different value systems around Western versus more Indigenous value systems, individualist versus collectivist. One of the big factors in our industry that makes us very competitive is the way we have to, I guess, compete on cost for work. Now, if our public sector took a different approach to buying work, instead of competing on a cost basis, they sort of put some social procurement measures in there, I think that would be something that could achieve some meaningful change in the culture of our industry. We'd certainly, it would support more collaborative working, it would support more relational ways of working, and I think it would probably support more collective improved outcomes. And the third thing, I think, as Stephen mentioned, the models of leadership. Servant-based leadership is a very common style of leadership if you're brought up in a Pacifica tradition. And like Stephen said, that model of leadership isn't recognised by the kind of performance frameworks that we have in our industry. And yet, a lot of people I've spoken to who've had Pacifica bosses find them really, really good. And I suspect that that's just something our HR industry needs to, it's a challenge for our HR industry to think about how we can design performance and incentive systems to reward that model of leadership, which I think offer a lot of benefits for employees and for organisations as well. So I hope that answers the questions.
Awesome, yes. So just before we get into the Q&As, I just want to open it up to the panelists. If anyone wants to add to anything another panelist has said, then feel free to jump in now and do that.
How are we for time, Mimi?
We have 11 minutes left, so we're pretty good. So
Okay,
feel
just
free to jump in.
we can go on and on.
Yeah, no, feel free to jump in if you would like to add to anything. Otherwise, we can get on to the Q&As. So I will start with the Q&As then. I'll start with this one here. At times I feel quite isolated being Pacifica in my industry. What are some of the things I can do to stay resilient?
I can have a go first. One moment. People being noisy in the background. I think, firstly, just acknowledging the journey of being in an engineering career is just like everyone else going through any other career, whether it be engineering, architecture, or outside of those industries. It's I always call it the journey of life and the journey of self-discovery. When you're journeying through a profession, you are learning more about yourself. You're learning how to function in a professional environment. You're trying to learn as an adult, and the journey of self-discovery can be very daunting. And for me, I had a challenging time coming into the industry and thinking, do I have to pretend to be someone that I'm not? And I do admit that there was a little bit of that at the start of my career. I had to suppress my Tonganness, the way that I'm Tongan and Pasifika. I had to suppress some of that. And as you gain a little bit more confidence in your work, then you bring out that person. And I can say I'm in a lot better space where I am proud to be Tongan. Where at work I had to, last year as an example, I had to defend why Tongans turn to Urahu at the every time for a test match to wave their flags, and I just had to explain it's in our culture. It's called mamahi mea. It's we go all out regardless, whether we play sports or whether it's studies. We will go all out and trying to explain that aspect of my culture and being more proud. So to go back to the question, I think there's two parts. I think definitely inquire within the business as to, oh, hey, what are we doing? But be mindful that you don't want to you don't want to stir up too much within the business. But if you have to get your voice across, then do so. I probably take a little bit more of a relaxed approach and drip feed. But at the same time, you also have a responsibility to yourself to highlight that diversity, whether it be a conversation in the corridor or whether it be you being proud of who you are. I think there's two parts. Yes, there's definitely, you can inquire to the HR or to business leaders, to business partners as to, hey, what are we doing in terms of diversity? How can we increase the diversity or the representation of my culture? But at the same time, I think everyone also has that little bit of responsibility themselves to do a bit more to in the workplace to represent your culture. That's my first stab at the question. Happy to hear other people's views.
Yeah, if I can add to that too, Mimi, thanks, Sifa. I think Sifa's touched on some really good points too. Yeah, I think it's also important once you are in that workplace or space, it's really important to maybe talk to your employers about, what's the company doing in terms of diversity? Is there any support systems for this? The other thing personally for me too was that I got to a stage in my life where I was starting to ask, who am I? What culture am I? And I had to hang out with mum and dad and all the elders before they started dropping off respectfully, because I wanted to see what made me tick in that respect too. So it was all about, Sifa alluded to, finding out about yourself. And if you proudly find that out, however which way, through your parents, through your cousins, through however you get. I'm fortunate. I live in Manga in South Auckland. I'm a really proud product of South Auckland. So we have community events, family events, and stuff like that, where we all just mingle. We all kind of know each other as well. So I think it's all about self-discovery through your own sort of personal journey with family. And I know we're communal people. We are family-orientated people too. So I think these are the strengths that you probably need, just so you can walk into that, diverse workspace. I pray that it is diverse, and you're able to thrive. That's what the bosses want to see you, is thrive and be successful in the position that you have applied for. So I'm just adding into the discussions that Sifa has alluded to earlier. Great question.
Thanks. And we just have one here. I know of MPIC in Christchurch and SPPEEX in Auckland that are good support networking groups for Māori Pacifica engineers in those city centres. Are there any others? Are there others in our other cities or towns? And has there been thoughts around establishing or expanding those existing groups to other places?
I think so. Or mention MPIC first, so Anna and Sina has to respond first.
I'll share about MPIC. I guess MPIC started. I might pop back to that last question and refer to that, from loneliness. From feeling lonely in the profession. So I was maybe 5 years in engineering before I worked with, on a job, the first Pacifica person. And I was so excited. And he is a member of our MPIC community. And we used to talk about, there must be more of us. There just must be. Let's all connect and share about our challenges and feeling isolated, and ways to address that, ways to improve it that were self-determinate and from our own communities. So I guess the challenge is often, because a lot of us too are very connected and involved with families and communities, at least with MPIC, I guess the challenge has been resources and capacity. There's a desire to do more, and to connect with people from other regions. I guess the challenge for us has been our own personal capacities. But I guess, with what we're seeing with post-lockdown, everyone is so much more connected virtually. So even with Specs and MPIC, I feel like we haven't done anything together, but we, as people and individuals, we are getting quite connected just because we start to form relationships. So I feel like that's a very good wedo or challenge for MPIC and Specs to, at least for MPIC, to look at trying to draw on technology a bit more to connect with people from other regions. I guess, I'm not aware of any others. MPIC started because we were looking to connect with other people, and we couldn't find any organizations like that here in Ototahi, or even in nearby, like in the South Island. So I would love to see more. If anyone's listening into this and is thinking about starting to run an event, and connect with others in their areas, in other areas, then do reach out to us and we'll share, you know, how we started running our events, what was involved with it, you know, any templates, that sort of thing. Within our own community, we have, there's an amazing engineer who, I don't know if you'll mind me sharing his name, but he was the one that I met after 5 years working in engineering. He's a structural engineer, and he actually, we use our MPIC Zoom account. He runs sort of online webinars, sharing his lessons learned from structural engineering. So there are those networks there, and I guess at least for me personally, I would just like with open arms say, do please get in touch with us, because I've definitely felt very isolated at times, and my way of being resilient has come through connection.
Awesome.
Sorry, the second part of the question was about SPICS, and similarly to Honor, yes, we are predominantly based in our areas, so SPICS in Auckland and MPIC in Christchurch. But I'll take the liberty of saying, Honor, that we're not exclusive to these cities, and we do try and reach out to people in the industry outside of those areas. And I mean, good question by So'o, who is a member of SPICS and living in Christchurch. So that's an example of us trying to reach outside of Auckland, and we even have members overseas doing OEs as well. But keep in mind as well that these groups are run on an oxygen budget and on love. So we don't get paid for running these groups. We have a day job, and it's very stressful. And it goes to say that because we have high demand careers, when we leave the office, sometimes you just don't want to see another engineering calculation, another structure, another consent, just because, you know, we want a break from the high demand work. And so it is a lot of work for us to work outside our day jobs to bring everyone together. However, we are doing the best that we can to try and increase the activity, and also the amount of work that SPICS, and I'm pretty sure MPIC is doing the same as well, to get out more and engage with more people. So reach out to us if you can. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think that is actually probably all that we have time for, as it is 1:15. If we didn't get to your question and you do have a burning question, then please feel free to send it through to hello@diversityagenda.org. You can find that on our website, and we can pass it on to the panelists and get those answered for you. But I think we're going to have to wrap it up now. But thank you so much to our amazing panelists for this absolutely fabulous conversation today. We're so very grateful for you sharing your insight with us all and including us in this conversation. And thank you so much to everyone who has attended. This will be recorded, so keep an eye out for it, and you can share it amongst your colleagues and on your company pages and everything. So yeah, keep an eye out. Thank you all very, very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Mimi.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.
Good to meet.
Thanks.